Good evening and welcome everyone to the Osler Club. We have a very engaging program planned for you this evening. But first we have the fun part of our program, which is awards. I'd like to introduce Roxanne Ratty. Roxanne is one of our outstanding Osler student scholars, and she has some Thayer Awards to tell you about. Roxy?
Hi, and good evening. My name is Roxy Roddy. I'm a third-year medical student, and it is my honor to be in charge of the Thayer Award. The Thayer Award is presented on behalf of the Osler Student Scholars, and it's awarded to 2 residents at every Osler Club who exemplify dedication to scientific teaching and dedication to educating our medical students. This month it is actually even more of an honor for me because this is my last time to present the award. I've been at it for 2 years, and you'll have to hear from somebody different in 2 months. But in addition to honoring the 2 awardees tonight, I'd also like to take a minute to talk about the hundreds of residents who have also been nominated in the last 2 years who didn't get to win. As any of the medical students here know, and anyone who's faculty, the residents really can make or break a clerkship for the medical students. At the end of the day, you could have a great attending, you could have maybe a more difficult attending, but it's really about your team that'll shape a medical student's overall impression of a clerkship. So we are really, really lucky here at UTMB to have some really amazing residents. So on that note, this month in particular, I'm happy to announce that we have 2 really outstanding internal medicine residents. Both of them are second year, or in the second year of their program, and neither of them could be here because they're busy teaching and helping out patients in the community. So I'm going to just kind of give you guys a little bit of a flavor for what was written about them by their medical students, and if you see them in the hallways or on the wards, please let them know that we really appreciate their efforts. The first awardee is Dr. Ahmed Al-Mamani. He's a second year in internal medicine, and his student just wrote a glowing recommendation about what an amazing teacher he was, how excited the student is for Dr. Al-Mamani to be an attending someday, because he really thinks he's one of the most amazing residents that he's ever encountered, and he would take time to go over topics and really teach students when, you know, he could have been spending time writing orders or doing things that could get him home a little bit earlier, but instead he spent time teaching. So Dr. Al-Mamani will receive $200, and the chair of his department will be notified of how thankful his medical students are. And our second awardee is Dr. Keda Joshipura Pandit. She's also a second-year internal medicine resident. Dr. Joshipura demonstrated sound scientific knowledge, compassion toward all of her patients, and dedication to learning and teaching her medical students. Her students were so impressed that she was never ever condescending or really talked down to any of the students, nursing, auxiliary staff. Everyone in the hospital is her equal. So this student was very impressed by how great an example to the interns and the faculty this resident is, and excited that she got to be on her team, and excited for other students who will get to learn from this resident. So that's Dr. Keda Joshipura Pandit.
Thank you, Roxy. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Barney Carnath. Barney is an Osler scholar. He also has been very, 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 very involved in education here at UTMB. He directs the POM2 course. He's co-director of the internal medicine clerkship. He has designed and rolled out a course, POM4, and he does about 500,000 other things in education as well that I just can't think of right now. Barney has a special award to tell us about, first of its kind.
Thank you, Dr. Beach. Good evening. The Practice of Medicine Year 4 course allows students the opportunity to reflect on their education and career paths under the guidance of a faculty mentor. Every month, students submit reflective essays for group discussion. Session 4 was dedicated to Sir William Osler. This evening, we would like to recognize the POM4 Essay Award recipients. And as Dr. Beach mentioned, this is the first year that we are offering this award. Our third place award goes to Sarah Struthers. Sarah? Each student will receive a copy of Bliss's book, a certificate, and a check.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah's essay was titled Reclaiming the Oslerian Tradition. Our second place award goes to Matt Hertzborn. Matt? Matt already received his check in the mail, so he gets a book and a certificate. Thank you very much. Matt's essay was titled Sir William Osler, a Vital Innovator in Medical Education. Our first place award goes to Jing Keith. Jing? Jing's essay was titled, What Would Osler Do?
Thank you, Dr.
Congratulations. Congratulations to all of our recipients. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carnath. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Jack Alpern to come up here. Dr. Alpern is one of our Osler Scholars Emeriti, and he is going to tell you a little bit about our speaker this evening.
Thank you, and congratulations to all of the awardees. It is a tradition with the Osler Club that the March meeting is to be presented by an Osler student scholar. And so our speaker this evening is John Dryden, who will be graduating from UTMB later this year, going into the United States Navy. John is a graduate of the University of Texas in Austin, where he majored in history, and was an outstanding student. He was in the Longhorn Band and was recognized as a outstanding trombonist. After finishing college in Austin, he spent some time traveling around Texas as a writing intern for Heritage Magazine, which is a publication of the Texas Historical Foundation, and was writing about things related to history in the state of Texas. While he was doing that, he was getting together all the necessary prerequisites to come to medical school. He'll be graduating UTMB later this year. Since he's been at UTMB, he's been an active participant in the St. Vincent's House Clinic for Indigents, and this year is one of the directors. He's been elected to AOA and been elected to the Gold Humanism Society. And last but not least, he's been a very active member of the Bowtie Social Club, where he served as president for 2 years. So he is a true historian. He's going to tell us some things about the history of Ashbel Smith. John?
Thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you, Dr. Alpern, for that great introduction. Dr. Alpern's the faculty advisor for the Bowtie Social Club, so I've had the privilege of working with him for the past few years in that endeavor. Like I said, first of all, I just want to say thank you to the McGovern Academy for this opportunity, and to Rosemary Lindley and Sharon Mosley also, as well as all the Osler scholars, and also the people who work with the Blocker collection for helping me out with this, namely Sarita and Bobby over there. And then finally, last but not least, but all of y'all, because otherwise I guess I would just be presenting to a mirror. So thank you for coming. Ashbel Smith is kind of an interesting fellow. You know, being a UT history major, even then I didn't really know a whole lot about the guy. So I think it's kind of interesting that somebody that's so influential to Texas history can kind of be obscured by time. Having the opportunity for the past year, I guess, to study and learn a little bit more about Osler, and then looking for somebody in Texas history, since that was kind of my field of study in undergrad, to talk about this evening, and for the previous Bowtie presentation. I found it interesting, all of the different parallels between the two individuals. Most of y'all have studied quite a bit about Osler, and I think the Academy does a good job of really pushing that and making sure that everybody knows who he was as an individual. So I think it's kind of interesting. if you were to just throw out a few different adjectives, physician, scholar, educator, humanitarian, bibliophile, orator, usually, at least in this group, I think we'd usually go toward Osler. We'd think about, oh, well, that's a perfect description of Sir William Osler and what he contributed. And yet, 50 years before Sir William Osler, who's considered the father of modern medicine, there was actually another individual. This is not the other individual, this is actually Osler, as it says beneath it. But 50 years before him, born in 1805 in Hartford, Connecticut, there was a man named Ashbel Smith. And similar to Osler in many different ways, as Osler was called the father of modern medicine, Ashbel Smith was titled the father of Texas medicine, and also the father of the University of Texas, and thus its medical branch where we are today. He gave a number of different contributions, so many that it's almost absurd to list them all. I'll go ahead and give you a taste of them. Contributions to medicine, education, humanism, politics, diplomacy, agriculture, ranching, warfare, finance, transportation, immigration. It's really amazing that somebody in 80 years of life can have that kind of an impact on everything in so many different fields. And thus, in a lot of ways, I think you can best describe him as being a Renaissance man in the true traditional sense of it. Something that we don't really tend to see much anymore in today's society as things have become so specialized. In fact, one of the first graduate of the University of Texas, Dr. Samuel C. Redd, who graduated just after the opening of the university in 1883, he ended up becoming a doctor. He was a student of Ashbel Smith. I think he best described Ashbel Smith as this: he's a man who stands out not as a man typical of his day and time, but as one of those unusual characters of mind and heart that make him accomplished in whatsoever direction he may turn his attention. I think that pretty much fits the description of a Renaissance man. If we're going to draw a few parallels just briefly between Osler and Smith, first of all, there's the Renaissance man, which we've been talking about. Both of them were not really specifically specialized in one specific type of medicine, but they, seemed to kind of fan out and know a little bit of everything, and that held true for life as well. They were both physically smaller men. Ashbel Smith was just a little over 5 foot. He only weighed 115 pounds, which even for the early 19th century would be considered small. I guess back then, if you were to look at a prominent figure like Robert E. Lee, for comparison, who stood 5'10", he was considered a rather large man, but the average height was probably around 5'6" or so just over 5 foot. And then a few other interesting parallels. Both were men who had 3 separate countries that they lived in and contributed to. Osler, of course, was Canadian by birth, and then moved to the United States and contributed to the different medical schools in Pennsylvania, and then founding of Johns Hopkins, and then he ended up moving over to Great Britain, where he did quite a bit of work and lived out the rest of his days. And then if we were to look at Ashbel Smith, who was born in the northern United States as a Connecticut Yankee, and then ended up moving down to Texas and served as its Secretary of State, served as its minister to England and France, and contributed quite a bit to that country until the Republic was annexed into the United States, and then, despite being against secession, actually sided with his home state of Texas, much similar to other individuals who were against secession. I'll draw another parallel to Robert E. Lee in that he ended up fighting for the Confederacy. So both were men of 3 separate countries. Both were also bibliophiles. Osler is famous for all of the books that he contributed and the libraries that ended up being started from those. And then Ashbel Smith, who, of course, being born 50 years earlier, it's even harder to get books. Living in the Texas frontier, where it's almost impossible, he ended up having a collection of over 4,000 books, which formed the nucleus of the UT library. And then, of course, and perhaps most importantly to us here today, both of them established medical schools. Osler, Johns Hopkins, and then, as I like to refer to it, UTMB. Well, actually, I'd rather refer to Harvard as the UTMB of the North. So, and it was actually established with that idea that it become the preeminent medical school in the southwestern region of the Greater Union. So all of that being said, I'd like to say that it's a little bit interesting that a presentation has never been done on Ashbel Smith before, since he is the father of UT, the father of UTMB, and all of his dreams make possible where we are here today. In many ways, he's a man of mystery, one of those giants of a bygone era, upon whose shoulders that we stand here today. His face, kind of obscured by the passage of time, unless you're looking at this photo up here. It doesn't look very obscured, but even the building, which is preferentially called Old Red, which is actually named after him, Ashbel Smith, all of us know it by that nickname, Old Red. So this evening, I'd like to go ahead and help to illuminate a little bit of that face, and maybe in the future provide some opportunities for some other presentations, because this is a man with an extremely, extremely rich history, one of the fathers of Texas, and someone who lived long beyond many of his contemporaries and contributed to literature and medicine and other areas, and I hope that maybe this hopes to spur a little bit of interest in that subject for the future. Ashbel Smith, as I described him at first, probably best a diminutive man, 5 foot tall, 115 pounds. He was described by his friend Samuel C. Redd, who actually wrote one of the first biographies of him in the 30s, who, as I mentioned, was the first UT graduate. He was described by him in his later years as having a full beard and yet extremely scanty. I think this picture is probably a little bit generous of him. We'll see some other actual pictures of him a little bit later, and I think you'll get a better idea. He had chestnut hair, as you can see here, thinning in his older age, and penetrating blue eyes. He was also described as usually wearing a stovepipe hat. He was always immaculately groomed and was said to look like an Englishman. I'm guessing that's by his dress, because since he's white, he probably did look like an Englishman. Also described as no one with the greatest stretch of imagination would call him good-looking. And that might describe a little bit of his being a lifelong bachelor and having proposed 3 times, and not ever being married. But we'll see. Finally, his voice was described as his greatest asset, perhaps other than his mind, a resonant, stirring voice, and that made him a very, very powerful orator. And also within his belly, there was a deep, deep fire that he had. He was described on several different occasions. One of them, he actually ended up resigning his commission as the Surgeon General of the Texan Army for actually attacking a guy on the Texas Senate floor with a horsewhip and beating him. The guy was probably deserving of it, as he was responsible for some libel and slander against Ashbel Smith, but it's rather interesting that a guy who's 5 foot tall would end up attacking another guy who's 6 foot with a horsewhip. On another occasion, when he was in the House of Representatives, another senator thought it would be funny to, or another representative thought it would be funny to go over and put a little fake spider in front of him and dangle it when he was giving a presentation to try and scare him. So he actually turned around, hit the guy, knocked him to the floor, and started stomping on his back. I guess at 115 pounds it probably doesn't do a lot of damage, but anyway. And then he turned around to the governor and said, "And that's all of my economic policy for today." Ashbel Smith, kind of an interesting name. Named for the Ashbelite tribe of Benjamin. He came from a long line of Yankees from Connecticut, merchants, hat makers, etc. And growing up in Hartford, he had a deep connection to the American Revolution. Right before he was born, Washington had come through with his friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, and given a number of speeches and tours and received all of the dignitaries and the dignities of the city. It is also presumed, well, not, I won't say presumed, but postulated that he had some relationship to the to President Adams on his mother's side, both John Adams, the second president, and his son, John Quincy Adams. There's also a report just to describe a little bit more about his family. of one of his. He had a number of brothers. He had a half brother, and then he had 2 full brothers. One of his brothers was to become the Chief Justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court, and he had another brother who was actually a chronic gambler. So it's kind of comes from interesting stock, that I'd say. But one thing that seems to stand out about him and in comparison of his family and his times are all the different contradictions that he has. He best described his hometown of Hartford, Connecticut, along with his cousin, as the land of steady habits. So you can imagine this Puritan society, still, just fresh from the American Revolution, growing up in there, where people don't really go out and do a whole lot. It's very strict upbringing, very strict code, and yet, as we'll see, this guy is very nomadic and adventurous. Somehow he ends up down here in Texas. He ends up fighting for the Confederacy. His nickname was the Yankee Rebel. Growing up, he was described as a sickly child with a weak constitution, chest and GI disorders. But if we notice, he also outlives most of his contemporaries, lives to the ripe old age of 80, almost 81. He also seems to travel quite a bit, get around. He goes to Europe multiple times and seems to survive a number of different episodes of yellow fever, malaria, the chest problems, before he ends up succumbing at the age of 80 to pulmonary conditions. As a juxtaposition also to this kind of sickliness as a child and his weak constitution, we also see a very unique level of energy. If we're to talk about him graduating from Yale at the young age of 19 with both a AB and an AM. Also his intelligence. He was voted by all the professors and the president of Yale to be the best Latin and Greek scholar of the school. One of his teachers growing up actually wrote down that the algebra book that they used, Ashbel Smith, when he was in grammar school, went through and solved all of the problems for it, and the teacher used for the next 70 years. That is the key for grading everybody's papers. He was also elected to Phi Beta Kappa, which, as we all know, is a very prestigious organization. After he graduated from Yale, he moved down to Salisbury, North Carolina. Kind of an interesting choice for somebody from up north, but he went down there to teach for a while. He had a lifelong love of education and appreciation for it, especially thinking about this time when most people didn't have any formal schooling. Somebody who's already graduated with a master's and is going on to medical school on a formal side. After that year that he spent down there, he went ahead and went back up. He decided he was studying law for a short time. There's a couple of conjectures as to why he switched. Some of them being that for health reasons he wanted to go back up north and study medicine. I actually like, and that's the one that's kind of shown the most, I actually like Red's opinion on it, that the idea of medicine in its transformative state in the 19th century, from an art to an actual science, and all of the different questions out there intrigued him and was a great mystery for somebody with such varied talents. At any rate, for whatever reason, he ended up leaving North Carolina and he went up to work in New York at the hospitals up there, and then he went over to Yale, where he graduated in 1828 with his MD. During this time, he was also influenced by one of his professors, a science professor, Benjamin Silliman, who helped to found Yale Medical School and might have influenced his own desire to found schools, as he was so apt to do in his later years. One of the other contradictions I'd like to point out are his strict outline, his strict Puritan upbringing, and his of life, the 12 hours plus that he would work a day. He almost sounds kind of like a manic person, just doing all these different things all the time, moving around, and then prone to bouts of depression for months at a time sometimes, where he would retreat back to his home only to be called out by one of his friends. This strict upbringing is also in juxtaposition to his love life. He was a lifelong bachelor, but as we'll see, he has a history with a number of different women throughout his life, or as he wrote in a letter to his sister, the affairs du coeur, or love affairs. In fact, there's a couple of different references in his in his journal to possibly even having a child out of wedlock and paying 2 notes for $30 to the father of the woman who had the baby. But that's kind of just conjecture. Following his graduation from Yale and time in the New York hospitals, he ended up going back to North Carolina, where he spent a couple of years. He developed a very successful practice. He was never, although he might have been short of some funds just because it was the 19th century and living then, he was actually a pretty wealthy man for his time. He was able to contribute back to his family quite a bit of money. He seemed to always be able to make money, whether it be from land or from his practice of medicine. Medicine, however, in the 19th century in America was kind of a process more of trial and error. So if we're thinking about even Ashbel Smith, who graduated at the age of 19 and has had a little bit of resident experience in a hospital in New York, he's really only had 1 year of medical training at Yale. And that's pretty typical, and that's actually toward the better end of it. There's these other types of degrees that you could get from different universities, different private enterprises. Basically, these were just kind of degree mills, where if you could pay the price to go ahead and get the degree and pay for tuition, then they said, oh, awesome, go ahead and head on out there and practice some medicine, do some good old-fashioned bloodletting and with some leeches and some poisonous tonics. As we know, George Washington didn't end up so well from all that bloodletting. So probably not the best style of education at the time, but that's what they had. So if you were actually very serious about medicine at this time, you would usually go ahead and head on over to Europe, Paris being kind of the mecca of the education and modern medical education, where they were kind of, like I was alluding to earlier, transforming medicine from an art to more of a science. The average medical education, just to give you an idea, even up until 1891, when UTMB opened, was actually less than 1 year. And this is back in the 1830s when he ended up heading over to Paris, where at that time they were trying to turn medicine into more of an evidence-based type of enterprise, into more of a science. So there he studied medicine in the early 1830s. He was interested at that time in surgery, and he spent a couple of years over there, 12-plus hour days, described as getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, doing rounds by candlelight, and he met with the most prestigious and had the opportunity to work with the most prestigious individuals of his time: Baron Guillaume Dupuytren, Jacques Lisfranc, Baron Dominique Jean Larrey, who was one of the field surgeons with Napoleon and actually the father of battlefield medicine and first aid hospitals, as well as Charles Alexander Louis, who founded medical statistics, Baron Georges Cuvier, and René Laennec, who, as most of y'all probably know, invented the stethoscope and is the father of chest medicine. And it's almost like Ashbel Smith, in certain ways, it's kind of like watching a Forrest Gump movie, where this guy just seems to end up being in every type of situation ever. It's really remarkable that this guy was friends with all of these different people, had the opportunity to meet with all of these different people, and that's why I think it's so amazing that more people don't know about him, that he's not more famous, because he also contributed to all of this, as opposed to Forrest Gump, who's just kind of floating along there. He also studied while he was in Paris at several prestigious places: the Hôtel de la Pitié, Necker Hospital, and the Hôtel or Hospital des Invalides, which, if you've ever been to Paris before, I know Rosemary just got back, is actually the place where Napoleon's buried. So y'all, if you've ever been there, more than likely visited it and been to the hospital where Ashbel Smith trained over in Paris. Paris life, going back to this Forrest Gump theme, for Ashbel Smith, I have no idea how he got into these different circles, but at one point he ended up at a ball where he was able to see the kings and queens of Spain and Portugal. He ended up befriending James Fenimore Cooper, who introduced him to his Polish committee. At that time there was a war between Russia and the Polish nationals, and so there was the Americans would send over different funds for the Polish nationals, different funds and supplies and everything. There's a Polish committee headed by James Fenimore Cooper in Paris to disperse those. to the those suffering from the war effort. And in that group, he was able to meet the Marquis de Lafayette, who I'd already mentioned, who was one of the famous individuals from the American Revolution, and had also been through his hometown before he was born. And he also ended up meeting Samuel F.B. Morse, who we'll come back to in a little bit. He seems to also be excellent at networking. Once he meets these individuals, he always makes a point of any time he's passing through an area to go back through and see them and to talk to them and to be friends with them and to always be writing. It said that he would just stay up way into the wee hours of the morning, just constantly with correspondence. Even when he couldn't afford a secretary, he was always writing to everyone that he knew. While in Paris, he also, the Great Cholera epidemic occurred of 1831 and 1832 there. And this is really, although an unfortunate incident, it's described as having bodies piled to the ceiling, just naked bodies everywhere in all these different hospitals. He was working as a resident, actually, at the Necker Hospital at this time. And during this time, though, it provided him with a really excellent opportunity to practice this new style of medicine, this evidence-based medicine that we today still utilize so much and is taught to us. The cholera epidemic was a little bit interesting in that it originally afflicted the lower classes. So there was an idea out that it was actually a plot by the aristocracy and by the different medical professionals, the doctors, to kill off a lot of the lower class population. And as such, a lot of doctors were being killed, a lot of doctors were fleeing the country, and especially Americans were just, were out. So a lot of them are leaving the continent at this point and heading back to the United States. Ashbel Smith always won up for a challenge, along with another doctor, ended up staying, however, spent all of their off-hour hours working in the Necker Hospital, providing aid to all of these different individuals. Smith was actually affected himself and ended up treating himself successfully. And in addition to James Fenimore Cooper's daughter, who he also treated successfully. With every opportunity that he had, though, he was helping these individuals and he was also observing. He didn't make any conjectures about this. He didn't have a hypothesis. He just had these different, all of these observations, these autopsies that he would do, multiple autopsies every night, to try and see what was this. Not necessarily what's the culprit, but what is it that we're facing. And in the end, he actually ended up in 1832 coming up with this publication, Cholera Spasmodica, as observed in Paris in 1832. I should go ahead and say that Ashbel Smith, in addition to Latin and Greek, was also fluent in French, Spanish, and obviously English, and ended up learning Cherokee as well. So when he was publishing these things, when he was having all these discussions, he was able to, on somebody else's terms. He wasn't able to, or I guess more on his terms. He wasn't dependent on translators or anything. So his different works such as this were highly praised. And then I'd like to just read just a small little sample from this to show this idea of evidence-based medicine and how he was kind of a proponent of that. There's actually a copy of this over in the Blocker History Collection. We have an amazing collection over there. Like I said, they were very helpful. There's also a number of his works that are over at UT Austin, which are available for looking at. And if you haven't, I'd highly recommend going and checking them out. You can also see these online. That's one thing that our school's done that the main campus UT hasn't done, is actually put a number of his letters online where you can see them anytime you want. As he writes at the very beginning of this, I determined to confine myself to the relation of what I have seen. To this determination I have strictly adhered. I have related facts which I have seen, and for the truth of which I therefore pledge myself. I have described no symptom, no post-mortem appearance, no treatment which I have not myself witnessed. I was actually talking to Dr. Brody a little bit about this in a book that he has suggested to me. I haven't had a chance to look at, named Against the Spirit of the System, published in 1998 by J.H. Warner, which, if you're interested in this whole idea of art turning into science and this evidence-based medicine and where it kind of comes from, I think it would be an interesting book to have a look at. So after he published this, and the cholera epidemic abated, he ended up heading over to England. In addition to surgery, he'd actually also had this deep interest in psychiatry, having worked at a mental institute in New York. Seems kind of interesting for a person to be interested, at least by today's standards, in both surgery and psychiatry. And yet he worked there at the New Bethlehem Hospital for mental diseases. And while he was there, in addition to working for a number of years, he also would take time, or for a number of hours every day, he would also take time whenever he could to go out and meet different individuals. He would go to the Parliament, listen and write down all of the different words that they used in English and compare them in English and compare them to American English, and published a number of different papers on that, his different thoughts about the etymology of each word. He actually listened to several notable figures of the day, Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel and historian and Secretary of War Thomas Macaulay, who Red actually kind of described Smith as sounding like Macaulay, or at least kind of didactic in his speeches. And then during this time, he ended up kind of having a love interest with James Fenimore Cooper's daughter, and they ended up being kind of pen pals for quite a long time. After his training there and his time in England, he ended up going back to the United States, where he opened up a successful practice in North Carolina for a couple of years. He also, during this time, wrote for the American Journal of Medical Sciences. He was a collaborator in that from 1835 to 8. This was published by Dr. Isaac Hayes. And in this, we can see some of his different surgical techniques that he reported successfully performing, including rectovaginal fistula repair, depressed fracture of the skull, malignancy of the eye, and breast cancer removal. So he was definitely very experienced in that, and his skills were sought after by everyone that could find him in the United States. At this time, he also started to dabble in politics, as well as the writing that he'd been doing. He became an editor for the Western Carolinian, which was a nullification paper. It's kind of interesting. This is one of those contradictions of him being born in the North and thus a Yankee by birth, but supporting kind of the Southern idea of nullification and states' rights. In fact, when he became editor, there's a quote that they had of the readership not fearing about the change in ownership, that they would continue to quote the bold advocacy of a strict construction of the federal Constitution and consequently of the rights of states. During this time, Andrew Jackson was also president, and they were having the fight over the tariff in South Carolina. This whole idea of nullification was coming to a head, and Jackson was threatening to, well, South Carolina was threatening to secede at that time, which actually isn't a new idea. New England had threatened to secede during the War of 1812. That's kind of a misconception, but that's another speech for another time. If we're going into the tariff war, though, where South Carolina is threatening to secede, and Jackson, who's actually a Southerner, threatening to send the army of the United States into South Carolina and invade them. Most Northerners are for this, and yet Smith, who's more the Yankee rebel, is actually adamantly against this. He also writes about, and we kind of start to see some of his views on slavery and abolition and the interference of the North in Southern politics at this time. Just a few other descriptive things about him. In 1833, he became a member of the Episcopal Church. It's kind of interesting that he never described himself as, quote, religionist, unquote. And by that, he meant that he didn't necessarily believe in one particular sect of, that sect as in sects, of some type of religion. He kind of took all of it and was a student himself of the Bible. At this time, he was also delving into agriculture, where he decided to buy a farm while he was down there for a couple of years, and also 40 slaves along with that. As I mentioned, he was dabbling in politics. He had the Western Carolinian he was writing for. He became a magistrate. He became a justice of the peace. And then his love life was kind of developing. He was in his late 20s at this time, early 30s. A lot of people were getting married, starting families. He had a relationship with Susan Cooper, James Fenimore Cooper's daughter at one time. There was another woman in the Salisbury area named Antoinette Huey, who he had a relationship with. And then another one, Mary Louise Pfeiffer, who he actually proposed to and was the first of many to reject that proposal. After this, we kind of see a change in his personality. I guess somewhat unrequited love affecting him, and then he was still she didn't actually outrightly reject him. She had said that they didn't really know each other well, and so he was writing all this time to her while he went up to New York for a while and was looking for a job up there, working in a hospital. And I think it actually ended up scaring him how much while he's trying to accomplish all of this in life, it ended up kind of alarming him how much that he could be attached to another person and how much that could maybe affect his accomplishments and his ability to accomplish what he wanted in life. And he actually wrote after this that, "You can't well conceive the deep mortification I feel when I recollected my little bookish and worldly knowledge dispersed and forgotten, and my heart filled with dark, bitter, brooding imaginations." So at this time, he was kind of ready for an adventure. He'd been, a little bit distracted by life in the small rural town of North Carolina. He ended up traveling throughout the southeastern United States. During this time, he was making investments, buying up public lands, and while he was there, he met with James Pinckney Henderson, who would end up becoming the first governor of Texas after it joined the United States. He ended up with a deep interest in Texas. Henderson and people were out recruiting for the war which was happening between Mexico and the United States. And around this time, while he was debating whether or not to head down there to help out the cause of the burgeoning republic, he had one last meeting with James Fenimore Cooper, at least at this time, and Morse. Morse was actually, this is just kind of a little interesting side story, Morse had been and was a fantastic painter. And when they were commissioning for the 4 panels in the new Capitol building to be painted, it was kind of interesting that they rejected him because he was an American painter. The idea, of course, being that European painting and everything European was superior to American. So Ashbel Smith, who was a friend of Morse, ended up talking to his friend Cooper, who wrote, James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote some scathing letters down there. However, he didn't write his name on them. He wrote them anonymously about, you should support the American cause and our new art industry and everything like that. So the people in D.C. actually thought that it was Morse himself who wrote those letters. And thus he was outrightly rejected for the commissioning. So instead of painting, he ended up turning his attention to the telegraph, which was probably a fortunate series of events. So he's interested now. It's 1836, 1837. He's looking for something new. So Smith goes ahead and takes the advice of Henderson, and he heads on down to Texas. Henderson had promised him a few different things: a salary of $2,500, 20,000 acres, and rations during this time. If Texas had nothing, then it didn't have land. He was promised also a position as an army surgeon in the Texian army. By the time he actually got down there, it was 1837. The war had ended back on April 21st of 1836 with the Battle of San Jacinto. A very short 20-minute battle in which the troops of Santa Anna were routed. And a few days later, Santa Anna was captured. But there was always this threat. That was actually only a small, tiny part of the Army of Mexico. And Santa Anna surrendered the entire war because he had been captured and he didn't want to be executed. But most of the army was still present down there and was a continuous threat throughout the decade-long existence of the Republic. So he was offered this position as an army surgeon down there. And he wrote this: "As a citizen of Texas and of the U.S., I shall oppose the annexation at all hazards. If Texas can conquer her independence from Mexico, no good reason will exist for an union under this government except to prevent the evils of a conquest and forcible subjugation of it by ourselves." It's interesting that he's actually writing about the United States. He's already adopted Texas as his own, even though he has thoughts about moving back at times. But he's so patriotic for this new cause and this new country, and his own ability to mold this new institution, this new republic. During this time, he also is or as he's actually heading into Texas, there's a few interesting descriptions that he gives about the place. Usually it's described as a fantastic place, and then people who started to come here to support the cause are kind of appalled that there's absolutely nothing. He arrives, like I said, at the end of the war. Galveston at this point in time had one house on the entire island, and you got to Texas via Galveston unless you were coming through land, but everybody came from New Orleans by steamship or packet ship. So he comes down here through the canal and everything, or through the bay here. There's one house on Galveston. Harrisburg, which had been the capital of Texas for a short period of time, was burned to the ground. There's a battlefield, San Jacinto, which still had was a huge mess. And then he arrives in Houston, which is a new city. It's less than a year old. Augustus C. Allen and John K. Allen, two different brothers, had founded the town back the previous year, and had commissioned Tom and Gail Borden, who will also come up a little bit later, to design the town and start to build it. And there are about 1,500 people living here at this time. One of the first people that he meets is Sam Houston. Like I said, he just has this knack for running into all of the famous members of history that we all know about. They end up being roommates on a place which is modern-day Caroline Street. It looks as if it's probably not still standing because I don't think it lasted much beyond 1837. But the two of them lived together in this kind of dog trot house with a little thing in the center and then two cabins on either side. They lived on one side. And this is a really interesting relationship that he ends up forming, both Houston and Smith being roommates for this amount of time. Two bachelors at the time, living together, helping to form a new republic modeled after the American democracy to the north and east. And he describes a couple of things. It's actually kind of conjecture that Smith probably knew Houston better than most individuals. He would say that they would stay up 4 nights out of 5 a week, doing what he called battled the watch with incessant volleys of winged words. He kind of had there's a lot of different thoughts about Houston as being a gambler and a drunk and a fiery-tempered person, and Smith actually fought against a lot of those, saying that a lot of that was actually for show, showmanship. He wanted to be a man of the people and seem as such, but he was actually extremely intellectual, and Smith would stay up at night reading him till 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning by candlelight, and then they would have discussions over Greek philosophy and different subjects. And Sam Houston was also the person who offered him during this year of 1837 to become Surgeon General of the new Texian Army. It's spelled with an I, as they did in the time, as opposed to our modern Texan. And Smith, till his dying day, spelled it as such. He received the $2,500 salary, and in addition had his private practice where he received $5 per call per patient, so it was $25 to $35 a day. He also ventured into real estate. He kept immaculate records. The individual who I spoke about earlier about who he decided to horsewhip on the Senate floor had actually accused him of stealing some of the public medical supplies and supplying them to his private patients. But he kept immaculate records and became so offended at that as an attack on his honor that, well, he attacked the individual. He also, during this time, ended up establishing the Medical Licensing Board under the Second Congress of Texas, established the first hospital in Houston, the military hospital, and ended up buying a lot of the medications that were supplied to the Texian Army in his own money, out of his own pocket. He ended up being a rather wealthy individual at this time, and the cash-strapped republic had no supplies at all to treat their different patients. In fact, he recorded during this time seeing a record day of 119 patients in one day. During this time, there was also a couple of different individuals who he became involved with. He helped to found as I said, he was interested in education. He helped to found the Philosophical Society of Texas with Marabou B. Lamar. Like I said, he was a successful man. He had $12,000 to $15,000, 4,000 to 6,000 acres, owned part of the new city of Galveston. And then he was also trying to encourage immigration down here at that time. He described Texas as having light taxes, fertile soil, a delicious climate, and yet scarce ladies. Due to the precariousness of receiving supplies from New Orleans, he actually made a trip during this time up to purchase supplies from the United States. And at that time, he was able to meet with President Van Buren and feel out some of the thoughts for annexation. He also met with John C. Calhoun, the prominent Southern politician and former vice president under Andrew Jackson. And he also bought some of the first books that formed the beginning of what would become the National Library of Texas. As I said, he was very proficient with languages. All the other ones that I listed, French, Latin, English, Spanish, Greek. And he also took the time to learn some Comanche, who had lived amongst the Indians for a while, was close with. And Smith was sent out to negotiate a treaty with them that lasted for a year and helped with peace on the frontier for at least that year of period. After Houston was, of course, the first elected president, David G. Burnett, who's actually buried here in Galveston, and there's Burnett Elementary School named for him over there, was the interim president. But Houston was the first elected president of Texas, and then after that, there were 3-year terms is what it was. So the next election, and you couldn't run in consecutive terms. You could run and be president more than once, but not in a row. So the other individual, Maribou B. Lamar, who was coming up, who was kind of opposed to a lot of Houston's ideas on annexation and federalism, Houston being a student of Andrew Jackson. Lamar's, some of his philosophies fit actually a little bit more with Smith. So although they were friends, Smith ended up kind of covertly supporting Lamar for president, especially since Houston couldn't run. And in addition to having the views on annexation of not wanting to be annexed, of forming this great republic, Lamar also had the idea of manifest destiny for Texas. And Texas, if we look at a map of it, it actually claimed all the way as the Rio Grande as its western border. Mexico had said no, the traditional boundaries of the Nueces down here, but as such, the Rio Grande being the border, the boundaries of Texas went all the way up into what's modern-day Wyoming. Of course, later during the compromise with Henry Clay of 1850, a lot of this was sold off in order to pay for some of the public debt, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into that right now, because it could take another 3 hours. But at any rate, so to go ahead and claim this area all the way out here to Santa Fe, Maribou B. Lamar contrived this idea of the Santa Fe expedition. There was actually an individual in it who had lived in Santa Fe for a number of years. I only say this because it's kind of interesting to me. His name was William G. Dryden, who kind of helped them to go out there, and it ended up being an ill-fated expedition, but he was involved with that. So Lamar and Smith were kind of concocting some of these ideas. There were also a number of different doctors at this time, as kind of another side note, who were very prominent in Texas politics. Anson Jones was the last president of the Republic of Texas. Dr. Branch T. Archer, for whom Archer County up in North Texas, just south of Wichita Falls, where I'm from, is named. And then, of course, Dr. Ashbel Smith. Let's see. I already mentioned the incidents of the horse whipping and his fiery temper. That ended up in his resigning his commission as Surgeon General, so he had more time for private practice at that time. Around the same time, around 1839, there also happened to be a yellow fever outbreak in Galveston. Galveston was a newly founded city. People had been living here. That's where the ships docked and everything. It was the perfect place for a city. But there were a lot of marshes around here, as well as Houston. And so this was the first of what would be 7 or so different outbreaks up until the beginning of the 20th century. Yellow Jack, vomit noir, occurred in September 1839. It was a dreaded disease, just like cholera. And Ashbel Smith ended up using some of his skills in evidence-based medicine to write this publication, which came out in 1848. The first attack, this one in 1839 that occurred, was near the Strand. There were a lot of marshes that were down there at that time. And going along with this whole idea of evidence-based medicine, Smith happened to note that the marshes were in close proximity to the area where the epidemic was worse. Now, although he didn't draw a connection with the mosquito at that time, he did suggest that they go ahead and fill in the areas with sand and lime. which the city did not do, and it probably would have helped to abate the different attacks. It would have cost $1,000 at that time, which was too much for the city. I think it's a little interesting that later in his career, he also suggested in the 1870s that they go ahead and construct a seawall in Galveston to prevent any storm surges, which also the state legislature didn't listen to till after the storm of 1900. He seemed to kind of be a sage in certain things, and there's a couple of other projections that he makes about oil and some other things that are very interesting as well. He also notes that it doesn't seem to be transmitted person to person, that there seems to be some other vector out there, and he's not sure about it. He writes down, or somebody in the city of Galveston at that time wrote down an interesting fact about how he proved that it wasn't person-to-person transmission. This woman writes, "We're fortunate in having an excellent physician, Dr. Smith. I'm perfectly well now, and all of our family are well, although we have had so many deaths in our house, and the yellow fever has taken away a great many on the island. Dr. Smith has opened up 9 bodies, has several vials of the black vomit, and has even tasted it. Dr. Smith is perfectly well and has never had any symptoms of the disease, and if it was not contagious, I think he would. Or if it were contagious, I think he would. There are 10 resident physicians on the island, but we think we have found the best." So he's gotten out of politics for a little bit. He resigned the Surgeon Generalship, and it's the beginning of a new decade. The yellow fever outbreak is abated. So he decides to go ahead and do what he's been doing all along, which is invest in some land, and he buys a plantation up in on Galveston Bay, not on the island, but up north of here and west of here. Whatever, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, up in Harris County, up around there on the bay. So he buys some land up there and starts a plantation. During this time, he's also he decides to go back to the United States and make a few visits and clean up some of his personal finances. And he ends up meeting Andrew Jackson, just another in the long list of individuals who he becomes friends with. At the end of 1841, Houston again becomes president on December 13th of that year and is inaugurated. He starts his term, and he recalls Smith to public service, remembering that he's proficient in French, that he's lived in England for a while. They're looking for a diplomat to help with some of the problems with the recognition of the new republic and to establish a footing for it. They have several meetings at the Tremont Hotel here in Galveston with between Houston, Smith, and Anson Jones, who will become the last president of the republic. And Smith is sent over to Europe with a long laundry list of tasks to accomplish, including a treaty of amity and commerce with England, to smooth out relations with France. The so-called pig war had occurred. Also another can be a lengthy discussion, but that was in Austin, where the charge d'affaires from the French to the young Republic of Texas had his garden trampled by a pig and decided to shoot the pig, and then his servant got whipped, and it was just kind of a weird occurrence. But anyway, there was almost a war apparently with France because of a pig. So he was sent there to smooth out relations with France and also get European powers to act as a mediator with the continuous conflict with Mexico, as well as gain recognition by Spain, obtain a treaty from Belgium, and get immigration and learn the opinions of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So very, very busy man for also having medical practice. His charge d'affaires in London, he met with the Foreign Office head, Lord Aberdeen at the time, and was trying to feel out England's opinion on Texas. Part of the problem was that Mexico was, at that time, although was a large country, they had a lot of promising different metals that they had. They had industries. They'd been a country longer under Spanish rule, but they were much older than the United States, although they had gained their independence later. So these European powers were a little bit hesitant to trade Mexico for what was just a frontier state, and a shaky one at that. In fact, there were 2 different ships that were being constructed for Mexico at that time, Montezuma and the Guadalupe, which were to be sent down as steamer ships and attack some of the Texas ports. The Texas Navy at that time was blockading the ports, but they were able to steam through it. In the long run, these ended up not mattering because they were damaged in a conflict with the Texas Navy. But he was very concerned about that at the time. He also met with a number of different dignitaries. He met with Leopold I of Belgium. He met with Washington Irving when testing the Spanish waters. He met with the Emperor of Russia, the King of Saxony, Queen Victoria, and Prince Albert. He met Charles Dickens. And he also met Pope Gregory XVI. So extremely, extremely well-known individual. He was also at this time, in all of his spare time, in search of love and had a relationship with a mademoiselle there in France. The French people apparently loved him for his whiteness. I don't really know what that means, but... and also ended up with a relationship with General Winfield Scott's daughter, and with another individual, Margaret Johnson, who will come up in a second. He wrote at this time, because that idea of annexation was on the table, he wrote at this time that I regard the union of Texas to the U.S. as impracticable, and the agitation of this subject, therefore, is injudicious as far as concerns Texas. So he's still very concerned about Texas remaining its own separate entity. He also contributed to the Royal Geographical Society in Paris a paper on Texas climate and geography at that time, which was headed by Baron Alexander von Humboldt. As the annexation attempts became more fervent and it became a little bit more clear that this might very seriously happen, some of the European sentiments changed, and they didn't want the United States to be a strong power that spanned an entire continent with two separate oceans. So Texas was a key to this, and keeping it separate was a key. So some of the sentiments in Europe are changing. However, Ashbel Smith at this time, the Texas Treasury is completely destitute. He ends up having to return to the United States. There was one failed attempt to pass annexation by both Texas and the United States. And as he returns, there's also a changeover in, remember, every 3 years the presidency. So Dr. Anson Jones is elected the last president of the Republic of Texas at this time. And Ashbel Smith is called to be Secretary of State on the day of his arrival when he comes in. He ends up trying to feel out some of the different opinions on annexation. Most Texans are fervently for annexation. There's a few people like Anson Jones, Marabou B. Lamar, Smith, who feel that Texas can make it on its own, that it has that power, and that they would rather it be a separate institution. And in order to, Anson Jones was actually very good, although he thought that about not giving his opinion on it. He wanted, along with Smith, for the people of Texas to have self-rule and self-determination. But to have the best version of that, what they did was they needed to have some chips to play with. They needed to make sure that they didn't have to be annexed, that the European powers would recognize them as a separate entity, that they could survive on their own so that they could get the most out of it. As such, Smith ended up negotiating a treaty with his equivalent on the Mexican side, the Smith-Cuevas Treaty, as a preliminary treaty, 90 days to prolong annexation, and in return, Mexico would recognize Texas as an independent nation. So Texas had gotten what it wanted, although the boundaries were still disputed, and could now go to the table with the United States and get exactly what they wanted out of that. Pay off their public debt, receive all the lands that they claimed, and retain their own public lands, which they ended up using for education in the future, and that's why we're here today. It's kind of an interesting thing. Because all the people were fighting for annexation and Smith was kind of opposed to that, they ended up actually burning him in effigy twice during this time. He writes down that, so far from regretting that I signed it, I rejoice in having done so. Texas enters the Union with brighter mien than she would have done without acknowledgement of our independence by Mexico. But for the treaty with Cuevas, history would have remained that, having wrested Texas from Mexico, we were forced to throw ourselves into the arms of the U.S. for our feebleness. He then returns to Europe in order to negotiate several treaties to make sure that the European powers are not going to start a war over annexation. He returns to the United States, and although he's against annexation, he feels that the majority of the people are for it, so he votes for annexation. Relying on the promises made by the federal officials and animated by affection for the country of their birth, sacrificed as on the altar their independent autonomy. He writes about the idea of annexation, and yet he votes for it because he feels that that's the common sentiment. December 29th, 1845, it's signed. In 1846, Anson Jones is present for Ashbel Smith is present as Anson Jones lowers the flag of the Republic. The final act in this great drama is now performed. The Republic of Texas is no more. Hands it over to James Pinckney Henderson, who will become the first governor, and they raise the American flag over the once Republic. Statehood. During this time, Ashbel Smith addresses a number of different things. He starts to address his idea of education, and we see how important it is to him. If hereafter I have any other pursuit than the strenuous practice of medicine, I shall devote myself to that of education. He ends up founding the Convention of the Friends of Education and also the Texas Literary Institute at this time. However, there's not a whole lot of time for peace. With the annexation, the Mexican-American War breaks out. 1846, Polk had been elected president on the platform of annexing Oregon and Texas. And the Texas Volunteers are formed in order to defend the border with Mexico. In those, Ashbel Smith becomes a soldier, and they defend the area around the mouth of the Rio Grande. Because of the invasion of Veracruz, instead of an overland attack, there's not really any action seen. And Smith, who's at this point in time already 41 years of age, is actually really eager to go ahead and see some combat. And he actually meets with General Zachary Scott Taylor, the future president of the United States, to complain that the Texans were not seeing enough, or as he said, Texians were not seeing enough action. He becomes sick during this time, heads back home for a while to recuperate. One of his bouts of depression also occurs. There's also a big outbreak of malaria. It's presumed that he was one of the sufferers from that. And he takes this opportunity to further continue his idea of evidence-based medicine. He notes that the brisk breezes in certain areas prevent different bouts of malaria. Around this time, the 1840s and 50s, there's some different ideas of Houston running for the White House on a platform, and Smith supports that. He also ends up with his love life proposing the other two times that he will in life, one to Margaret Johnson, who I had mentioned earlier. And as he's turned down, then he finds someone else almost immediately. Judith Pope proposes to her. That makes 3 denials, 3 strikes. He's out. And he decides no more from that. Although there's one theory that he had been engaged to somebody during the war between the states, and she ended up dying during the war while he was away, although that's kind of speculative. He also visits a new college in Memphis at this time, and practices medicine, cutting out of breast cancer in Houston's wife, treating different malaria and yellow fever outbreaks. He ends up only losing 1 patient in the 1847 outbreak as he's refining his different treatments. He also buys the home that he'll end up living on for a while. The Evergreen Plantation, which I mentioned, was over in Galveston Bay. In 1848, he founds the Medical and Surgical Society of Galveston. He becomes a delegate to the AMA. And during this time, he also gives numerous different speeches, publications, becomes involved with the railroads, goes to national education committees all over the United States. For a short time during all of this, he's also called to go back to Europe. He participates in the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace in London, and meets with Queen Victoria again, the Duke of Wellington, Horace Greeley, who will run for president later, Horace Power, the famous sculptor, Samuel Colt, Napoleon III, who had replaced his friend, who was actually a personal friend of his, King Louis Philippe I. During this time, he also becomes involved with a individual who had actually helped to found Houston, named Gail Borden. Gail Borden at this time was trying to build up this whole idea of a meat biscuit, kind of dried packing hardtack thing, so that armies could take it and it weighed 1/14 of the weight that it normally did, and you just added water and then it was a nutritious meal. It didn't really take off, and Smith and he ended up losing quite a bit of money on it, but his next venture you might remember a little bit better as Borden's Milk. Let's see, and then Okay, so around this time, there's also different political upheavals of the 1850s that are occurring. There's a couple of national conventions, Democratic national conventions, that Smith becomes involved with. 1852, the nomination of Franklin Pierce, he's there for that. He helps to found the TMA in 1853. He's on the drafting committee. The third and final time that he's burned in effigy, he's he's actually talking poorly about a party that was popular in Texas at that time called the Know Nothing Party. And for the last time, his figure is burned. He ended up fighting for the South in the during the war between the states. Let's see. I'll go ahead and skip to this part, which is his contribution to education, where after the war he turned back to education. The importance of that to him was magnanimous. Our education should never cease, no more in knowledge than in virtue. Our heads should become stronger as well as our hearts purer, is what he said about that. And back as far as 1839, there had been different provisions to help found a UT and a medical school as well. Different monies were set aside. The war between the states actually ended up causing a problem with that because all the funds were depleted. But after the war, he kind of rejoined that. He helped to found several different schools, one that became Prairie View A&M, Stewart Seminary in Austin, and also A&M, which was originally part of the UT system. In 1881, he served as president of the Board of Regents for the first president for what would become UT, and was a strong advocate of UT Medical School being here in Galveston itself. It's kind of interesting that amongst all of his accomplishments, it's kind of one of those ironies that although the medical department was approved in 1881, funding would not be available for the creation of its first building until 1890, when the main building, aka the medical department, aka Old Red, was designed by Nicholas Joseph Clayton. That's a picture of the first Galveston hospital. Here's Nicholas Joseph Clayton, who actually designed Old Red. And by the time the school opened, replacing the Texas Medical College in 1891, Smith had already been dead for 5 years, having passed away at Evergreen Plantation up on Galveston Bay. Yet through the myriad of contributions, including our very own UTMB, he seems to kind of live on, like the mortar that binds together the red bricks and granite of the building that bears his name. A testament to the strength of character, and perhaps the best personal representative of our school's unofficial motto, that we stop for no storm.